Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Giannetti of Homepage News, and welcome to the third installment of an online roundtable series co-sponsored by the International Housewares Association and the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance. IHA and CBA are working together to inform the housewares industry about PFAS chemical regulation and legislation in the US and Europe and best practices related to the issue. Since the first PFAS roundtable almost a year ago today, several laws have been enacted, conversations in Europe are in progress, and plaintiffs' lawyers have started targeting marketing claims in certain industries. A panel of experts on the PFAS issue will share key information with you today, insights and updates to help manufacturers, marketers, and retailers prepare for pending PFAS regulations and their impact on the domestic and international housewares industries. I'm pleased to welcome back our panelists, Fran Grossbeck, Managing Director of the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance, Thomas Lee, a partner in the Energy, Environment, and Infrastructure Practice Group of Bryan, Cave, Layton, and Paisner, and a leader of the law firm's PFAS team, and Tobias Gerfen, CEO of Swiss kitchenware company Kuhn Rikon, and president of the European Association for Cookware, Cutlery, and Flatware, also known as FEC. Questions may be submitted during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll get to some of those questions, time permitting, at the conclusion of the discussion. And with that, I'm pleased to turn the session over to Fran Grossbeck of the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance. Fran?
Thanks, Peter, and thank you very much to the IHA for the support in continuing the efforts to educate the housewares industry on PFAS legislation and keep everyone updated. PFAS legislation continues to grow and pick up speed. Bigger, more encompassing laws have passed or are being proposed with faster enactment dates, and they go beyond cookware and even beyond PFAS now. I want to thank Tobias and Tom for being incredible partners on this journey on staying on top of this issue. We've been together and spent a lot of time working to help educate and navigate this important topic, and their time and partnership are very appreciated by me and all the members of the CBA. The Cookware and Bakeware Alliance is a housewares trade association delivering critical industry resources as a voice of authority and influence, uniting the industry by setting engineering standards for product and consumer safety. And in honoring our 100-year history, our name reflects the incredible markets we represent, growing to evolve to include all our industry, not only manufacturers, but suppliers, brand owners, and retailers too. We're building industry excellence through engineering engagement, education, and expertise. The CBA continues to look for and work with partner companies and organizations that can help our members manage the legislation requirements, and our two most incredible partners on this topic for PFAS have been the FEC and BCLP. So thank you again, Tobias and Tom, for joining me today. In the following slides, we'll provide a quick review of PFAS, an update on US and EU regulations, and provide you with critical updates on this fast-moving topic. Going to offer a quick refresher on what is PFAS for those who may be new to the call. So PFAS is a group of chemicals that, when used, their intention is to enhance or achieve a certain outcome with the betterment of that product and or situation in mind. There are thousands of these chemicals in this family. Not all are in commerce. And last time we spoke, and I'm not 100%, Tobias can correct me later, but it's about 600. It's under 1,000 in use in commerce, but there are literally thousands in the family. This large family of chemicals do not all look the same. There are different groups, and each group has different characteristics. The first steps, when you look at PFAS, you break them out into different groups, such as fluorochemicals versus fluoropolymers, short chain versus long chain, or non-polymeric versus polymeric, whether they're water soluble, whether they're not water soluble. And then there's three key risk factors, which is mobility, toxicity, and persistence. So in understanding each individual's chemical rank on these risk factors and looking at their impact in our world, it's a complicated process. And this is what some agencies such as ECHA in Europe and the EPA in the US are trying to study and understand better. It's through this science that we will better understand these chemistries, and time is needed to do so. This is just a snapshot of the complexity of understanding the vast group of chemicals. If you were with us at our presentation in Chicago, you heard Tobias talk about this very interesting analogy that we brought up about mushrooms. So many people don't know that there are 14,000 types of mushrooms in the world. I was shocked when I heard this as well. Some are edible, some are toxic. And it took time and science to map all of this out and understand which is which. The same approach is needed to understand PFAS. We need time and science to learn about this complex family of chemicals and understand the full impact of the decisions we're making now on the environment and socioeconomic conditions, so we don't end up with regrettable substitutions and unintended consequences. Beyond our industry, you can see this is a great snapshot from the American Chemistry Council of where fluor technology is used. And you're going to see some very important industries that impact our everyday lives. Alternate energy, aerospace, electronics, yes, your phones, your computers, building construction, healthcare, military. It's far and wide, and it is an important technology, and that's why the time and science is needed to understand it. As we come back to how this legislation out there impacts our industry and the housewares industry, I want to clarify that there's two types of legislation we're dealing with. We deal with right to know or disclosure laws, and the others are outright bans of either PFAS or groups of chemicals. So in right to know laws, we believe these are good approaches to the complex topic. Example of this type of law are AB 1200 in California and Colorado HB 1345. Now, I understand as I say that many of you have been dealing with the cumbersome requirements in meeting this enacted laws, but the approach is the right one because consumers have the right to know what is in their products, and these laws enable and enforce this right. Both California and Colorado legislation is enacted, and Tom will speak a little bit about that later in the presentation, along with other enacted laws. AB 1200 is about more than PFAS. That's a big message for today. It requires products to report on chemical ingredients from 14 lists. It is not just PFAS. So if you fall into, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, the definition of cookware, you are affected by this law. AB 1200 in California and the Colorado HB 1345 have specific deadlines for labeling and for claims. Some are already here. And it's important to know what is required on your package, on your web page, and marketing claims. In AB 1200, there's strict prohibition of the use of the word free, for example, PFOA or PFAS free in marketing claims. The right to know laws actually present you an opportunity to promote your brand and educate the consumer through transparency and connection. It offers a way for you to be proactive and address these two major consumer trends and concerns. Before we leave the right to know laws in both types of legislation, it's important to understand the definitions within the legislation. And an important one I want to touch on here is the definition of cookware. As you see on the screen, it says cookware means durable houseware items that are used in homes and restaurants to prepare, dispense, or store food, foodstuffs, or beverages. Cookware includes pots, pans, skillets, grills, baking sheets, baking molds, trays, bowls, and cooking utensils. It is broad, and in some it's even broader, where they just define some legislation as products. This is not just about pots and pans. If you fall within the food prep world and you are used to prepare, dispense, or store food or beverages, you're involved in these laws. So it's really important. If you're not already engaged and educated on them, it's the time is now. The second part, which is the more concerning part of the legislation out there, is the ones that prohibit or ban PFAS and other chemicals. Right now, the hottest topic is about Minnesota, which is a ban on PFAS chemicals, as well as other chemicals. And then the other one is Maine's enacted legislation. Maine requires manufacturers of products that contain intentionally added PFAS to provide written notification. This date was originally this year, but it has been extended due to a new law that has passed, LD 217, to be out to 2025, because Maine is still figuring out their structure on reporting. But nothing else has changed other than an impact on small businesses, but not the definition of PFAS or other important criteria in that law. The Minnesota law includes regulations on other chemicals, such as lead and cadmium, and these laws are moving fast and getting broader. It's critical that all in the housewares industries get educated on these laws and how they impact their products. And with the quickly changing number of laws, what they cover and the scope, the number of products impacted is growing fast. So I just want to, before I turn it over to Tom, I just want to point out that as we explore this topic today, it's important for all housewares products categories to get educated and find out where these laws impact you and your products. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to walk through the U.S. legislation update.
Great. Thanks so much, Fran, and thank you all for having me here. So as both Peter and Fran have noted, there has been a huge explosion of legislation and regulation in this industry since we started doing these a year ago. What we want to do here is really focus in, we'll give you an overview, but then we're really going to focus in on the new Minnesota law. It is sort of a sea change in what we're seeing in the regulation of these types of products. So we want to kind of unpack some of the relevant provisions and definitions and hopefully give you a really clear understanding of what that law requires. So Fran, if we can advance here. Let's go one more slide, please. All right, so what you see is here a summary of all the different laws that have been enacted and are proposed, broken down into the two major categories that Fran just highlighted. So notice, labeling requirements, consumer right to know laws, and then bans or reformulation requirements. And you'll see the majority is in the notice and labeling column, and that was the regulatory trend. Until Minnesota enacted its law, Maine was the only other one that had a use prohibition. And as Fran noted, that only took effect in 2030. So, you know, it is a ban, but it was further out. So there was less immediate concern related to it. We had seen some of the other laws start off as a proposed ban and then transition into a notice requirement. But Minnesota sort of changed all that and went ahead with both an immediate prohibition and a long-term prohibition that applies to a broader range of products. And again, we'll talk about all that in more detail, but the point we want to make here is we had thought the trend was moving towards more notice and labeling. It seems like there is still some risk that some of these proposed ban laws may go forward. And you'll see that there are 4 other states that have laws that are currently being considered that would ban the use of intentionally added PFAS in certain products. So turning to Minnesota HF 2310, I will say for those of you who have tried to look at it, it is a very cumbersome bill. It is an appropriations bill. It includes a lot of budget components. So just unpacking it and finding where the relevant provisions are is a challenge in and of itself. So we wanted to give you this overview and then a detailed description of some of the items in there so that everybody is on the same page as to what it says. So the basic structure of the law it's sort of a combination of some of the other state laws we've seen prohibiting intentionally added PFAS in specific categories of products, and also the main structure with an initial disclosure and an eventual reformulation. So January 1st, 2025, the bill prohibits the use of intentionally added PFAS in a list of different products, which includes cookware, relevant to this discussion. In January 1st, 2026, all consumer products that contain intentionally added PFAS must be disclosed. You have to provide an explanation of what PFAS is in the product to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And that's very similar to the main requirement. And importantly, The main disclosure requirement goes into effect January 1st, 2025. So if you've already done your diligence and you've already completed your internal investigation to do your main disclosure, you should be in good shape to do your Minnesota disclosure. You just need to remember that you have to report the same products to that agency as well. And then ultimately in January 2032, all consumer products that contain intentionally added PFAS have to be reformulated. You can no longer sell consumer products in Minnesota that contain intentionally added PFAS unless you get an explicit exemption saying that it's a currently unavoidable use, there's no way to practically reformulate, and the agency allows you to continue. Practically speaking, I think we all anticipate there will be very limited circumstances where agencies are going to grant those kinds of exemptions. And it's likely things like some of the more key industries that Fran identified earlier, medical implants, anything related to national security, energy infrastructure. But I think the expectation is that most consumer products should have transitioned away from this chemistry by then. So that's the overall timeline. Fran, if we can go to the next, thank you. So sort of the big headline news in Minnesota is, as of January 1st, 2025, the law states that a person may not sell, offer for sale, or distribute for sale in the state cookware, which contains intentionally added PFAS. And I want to spend some time on that prohibition language first. So that means that all sales, all inventory that is available to customers by January 1st, 2025 has to be compliant, which means that there needs to be some forethought, some planning, and a transition away from that chemistry well in advance of that regulatory deadline in order to meet that requirement. And I know that there is a lot of sort of industry concern about lagging inventory, which may not be compliant. There may be things that were manufactured today that will still be on shelves by January 1st, 2025. So that's one of the potential topics for discussion with the Minnesota agency that we'll talk about in a little bit. But just so everybody's very clear on the prohibition, you will not be able to sell products that contain intentionally added PFAS, cookware contains intentionally added PFAS in Minnesota after January 1st, 2025. Cookware is a key definition, and we'll close this conversation with a more in-depth analysis of what is and is not cookware. But for the purposes of this law, the definition is very similar to what we've seen in California and Colorado. As Fran noted, it is broad, it is much more than just pots and pans. And where we draw that line, I think it's going to be one of the most intensive exercises that this industry is going to have to go through over the next year or two. And the last key definition here is the concept of intentionally added. Most of the state laws have similar ways of addressing this concept. And as Fran noted earlier, the main thing to think about is whether PFAS is being introduced during the manufacturing process to provide some functional effect, some benefit in the finished product. And that potentially excludes PFAS that are being used as a mold release agent or as a manufacturing process aid to help plastic resins come together. There are upstream manufacturing uses of PFAS that don't specifically relate to the function of the final product, but that is a very fact-specific determination that companies are going to have to go through on a case-by-case basis to evaluate whether the PFAS they're introducing is intentionally added for regulatory purposes or is more of a processing aid.
Can I just interrupt you briefly for a
Please.
second, because you're on this topic, and there was a question in there that asks if small domestic appliances are included in this. And I think just for the purpose of clarification, I'll give you a chance to answer that now.
Sure. And we have a slide about this at the end, but it's great. And this is sort of one of those burning questions around these laws is where is this line of cookware? The laws don't include any specific exemptions for small electronic devices, for any electronic devices. So the frustrating part, California and Colorado were the first two laws to sort of be enacted. California's online disclosure deadline has already passed. But in California, we didn't have an agency that was assigned to interpret and enforce the law. We're still waiting. It likely will be DTSC. There's a bill pending. But as of now, we don't have an agency that we can go to ask those questions. I will say that I and others have looked at the legislative history for these laws, and there's no real clear indication of where they intend that line of cookware to be. So one of the things that I think certain industry groups and private companies are considering is doing some targeted outreach to Colorado's agency, to Minnesota's agency, to say, first, can there be some exemption for lagging inventory? We're all committed to satisfying our regulatory obligations, but it is just a practical reality that there may be things hanging out there that don't comply because they were made long before this went into effect. Second question is this one. Please give us clear definitions of cookware. I mean, arguably, a stove is used to prepare food. Should that be considered cookware? I think there are a lot of things that clearly fall within the definition, but there's a big gray area out there that we just don't know. And unfortunately, because there hasn't been any enforcement around this, or fortunately, if people end up getting caught up in that, it's still very much up to companies to do their own evaluation and determine that until we get agency guidance. And that's something, the agency guidance component is something that, I know Fran and I are working on. So that is a very long and roundabout answer when I could have just said, we don't know. But that's the full context. We've looked at legislative history. It's not clear. We, in many cases, don't have agencies to talk to. But now that we do, we're going to be doing that outreach to try to get some answers, because it's an absolutely crucial question to answer.
I would like to just add something, Peter. Two things that we've kind of lived by at the CBA, which is if you have to ask the question, it's better to default on the air of caution and comply with the law. So small electrics, toaster is going to be different than a waffle maker. I did see waffle maker pop up in the questions. If it's used to prepare, dispense, or store food, and that's used to prepare food, I would default on the side of caution and make sure that you're covered and reporting and following these laws. I saw cutlery pop up. If it's used to prepare, dispense, or store food, that's used to prepare, default on the error on the side of caution and comply. It's just the better, safer way to be. It's better to have the homework and done your due diligence and them say, nope, doesn't count. And then you can remove it from your website or whatever, but if you have to ask the question and it falls in that definition. And of course, I'm not giving legal advice. Please, I will say, refer to your own legal teams. But if it falls in that definition, we always recommend, if you have to ask the question, protect yourselves.
And maybe if we can go to the next slide, there's an important definition in the Minnesota law that I think will at least help us interpret this a little bit. So if you look on the right there, we wanted to highlight here some of the key differences between the Minnesota law and the Colorado and California laws. First is the one that we've already touched on. It's a shift from a labeling disclosure, consumer right to know law, to a use prohibition with a pretty immediate deadline. In January 1st, 2025, when you think about the time it will take to reformulate, update supply chains, that is a very pressing deadline. But the second key difference between the California, Colorado laws and Minnesota is in California and Colorado, the focus was on food contact surfaces and handles. So they were thinking about human exposure pathways. So what is, if there is any transfer, and I know Tobias and others have thoughts about that, but if there is to be any transfer, they were focused on the surfaces where that's likely to happen to the food or beverage or through dermal exposure. Minnesota didn't include that food contact surface or handle language in their law. So, and I know this question came up in the Q&A, their prohibition on PFAS applies to PFAS in the whole product until the agency clarifies that. And we hope that they will, because, if you think about what the purpose of these laws is, it is typically to protect human health. And I think the Minnesota legislature didn't really understand the implication of what they were doing with that language, because prohibiting the use of PFAS, intentionally added PFAS, in an internal circuit in a piece of cookware that has an electrical component has no relationship to human health. I mean, we will never touch or interact with, our food will never touch or interact with that circuitry. So there's no, there's no human health benefit from that level of regulation. So again, that's one of the things that I hope we will have a chance to talk to the Minnesota agency about to get clarification on. But as the law stands today, it does not limit itself to food contact surfaces or handles. It prohibits intentionally added PFAS in the entire product. But that concept of food contact and handles is helpful, I think, in making that determination for those sort of fringe cases of what is cookware. If it has a surface where food or beverages come in contact with something, particularly a heated element, then I think the legislators anticipated that that is probably a cookware. But it's not a hard and fast rule, and unfortunately, we're still sort of a little bit feeling around in the dark in terms of where that boundary is. So another important, and since we're talking about this, and I sort of addressed it, but didn't directly, there's another question about, is there a difference between hot and cold items? Again, when you're thinking about it from a human health impact standpoint, I think heated cooking elements that have a food contact or beverage contact component are very much a regulatory focus. But the laws do say that it's any food contact or beverage contact surface. So, anything that holds your food in the refrigerator or your beverages as you dispense them seems to be within scope for the laws. And I'll answer the last question too. These are wonderful questions, so thank you for everyone's engagement. Is the disclosure to be done only specific parts of the product or more parts that are included? So for California and Colorado, which is the disclosure laws, they limit the disclosure requirement to food contact, beverage contact surfaces, and handles. So you don't have to disclose what's in, the foot of the product that holds it off the counter, or what's in some cases in the substrate of metal if there's no food contact or beverage contact. It's just those limited surfaces. So hopefully that's helpful. Going back to Minnesota and getting fairly deep in the weeds, but I think this is another important component that I haven't seen a lot of coverage around. So Minnesota's law allows the MPCA, the agency, to reach out to manufacturers if it suspects that a product contains PFAS but wasn't reported to MPCA. And it can direct that manufacturer to test the products. Either using specific individual PFAS analyte testing or more generalized total organic fluorine testing. If the testing shows that PFAS is present, you have to satisfy your reporting obligations. If not, then you can provide a certification saying that we tested and it doesn't contain PFAS. But here's the tricky part. The manufacturer must conduct the testing and make the required disclosure to the agency within 30 days. And that's not currently possible if you're going to use a US-based lab to do your testing. Typically, for whether it's individual PFAS analyte testing or total organic fluorine testing, I mean, we're looking at 30-day lead times from when they receive the sample, or much longer. I mean, I've seen 60, 90 days. So there's going to be, this is another opportunity for discussion with the agency about allowances, because there will be challenges in complying with this requirement, even when manufacturers have the best intention. So just something to focus on. in the Minnesota law. And, some companies, if they're sort of not sure about disclosures, they may not disclose, but do testing so that they have it ready to show the agency in the event that there is a question. Enforcement and fees. So criminal and civil penalties are available under both our criminal civil laws and administrative law. The MPCA can do the enforcement itself, or it can bring in other agencies as well, and can also recover its fees. So, if they have to go out and do testing, if they have to purchase products, they can recover that as well. So, we'll see, frankly, what enforcement will look like. I will say, unlike states like Maine, Minnesota is one of the better funded and more activist states when it comes to PFAS issues. So I think there is perhaps more of an enforcement risk in Minnesota than a state like Maine, where Maine has the best intentions, but their bill didn't really include any appropriations for their agency to enforce the law, so they just don't have the resources to do it. So there's another provision in the Minnesota law that I think some may have missed. And candidly, the first time I tried to slog all the way through it, I did too. But if you look, there is another use prohibition in the law, and it says that a person must not import, manufacture, sell, hold for sale, or distribute, or offer for use in the state covered products, and we'll talk about what those are in the next slide, that contain lead at more than 90 ppm or cadmium at more than 75 ppm. There are some exclusions. Doesn't apply to covered products where the regulation is preempted by federal law, so things that are already regulated under federal law. But generally speaking, this is a very broad-reaching prohibition on the presence of certain concentrations of lead and cadmium in products. It is also effective August 1st of this year. There's no effective date in the law for this provision, but under another provision in Minnesota law, anything that's enacted without an effective date becomes effective, in this case, by August 1st. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll give you an overview of what covered products include. It's pretty wide ranging. It is a variety of different consumer products that typically contain metal components. But you'll see right in the middle there, pots and pans, cups, bowls, and other food containers are covered. Now, this is not the same definition of cookware that we've been talking about. This is different, but it does include some of the traditional products that we think of when we think of cookware and related kitchen items. And this one, I think people in the industry have probably been looking at heavy metals for some time now. I mean, this is something that's been regulated under Prop 65 for a while, but this prohibition is different. I mean, Prop 65, again, it's a disclosure law. You just have to provide a warning on your product, whereas Minnesota's law now says you cannot sell products that contain anything above these concentrations. So something to focus on and evaluate. And I think this is a sort of recurring theme. We expect that there will be some dialogue with MPCA on when they will actually start enforcing this, given that the law was passed and the effective date is August 1st, and there's really no time for industry to react to the requirements of legislation. Okay, so the last thing we want to kind of touch on is this concept of what is cookware. And we just kind of laid out a variety of different things that could potentially fall under that definition. I think some clearly do, based on what we're seeing in the statutes, but there are a lot of gray areas here. And mapping this out, coming to your own conclusions, I think Fran's sort of rule of thumb, if you have to ask, maybe err on the side of compliance is certainly the safe way to play it. But really taking a hard look at all your products, where they fall in these spectrums, is going to be a big part of this exercise going forward. Maybe to Tobias, just quickly before I turn it over to you, there are a couple specific questions that relate to what we've touched on here. So maybe I'll just answer those quickly and then we can keep moving. Does AB 1200 require disclosure of aluminum substrate? The question there is whether or not that aluminum substrate is a food contact surface. If the nonstick coating is anticipated to remain in place for the lifetime of the product, then that substrate may not be a food contact surface. But that's the determination there. And I don't know what product we're talking about. I don't know what the anticipated durability of that food coating is, but that's the question you would need to answer in order to evaluate whether to disclose that. Again, to Fran's point, there's no rule against disclosing it just in case. So if you disclose it, no one will ever say that that was a mistake. Another good question, how many parts per million before a product is considered to contain PFAS? Is it any content at all, or is there a maximum ppm? So in some state laws, particularly in California related to other product categories, we are seeing concentrations that are used as sort of a proxy for intentionally added PFAS. But in these laws, it really is just, it's more focused on that intentionally added concept. Are you putting it in there for an intended purpose? Not, when you test the product or any product component, is it above 100 ppm or 50 ppm? Is there a provision for the size of the company? Maine has included an exemption for small businesses. Minnesota has not as of this point. That's another good point for potential clarification with the agency.
What makes a small business by Maine's, according to Maine? Is it number of them? Is it 25, 50 employees? How do they make that determination?
25.
Okay. 25 employees.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Well, being conscious of time, there's a lot of great questions coming in, but I don't want to monopolize the whole conversation. So maybe we'll pause there. Tobias, I'll pass it over to you, and then if we have time at the end, we can come back to some of these.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Peter. I'm talking about Europe, not the US. And in Europe, the situation is slightly different because some PFAS, so some substances have been restricted, like the PFOA and the PFOS. But for the complete group of more than 10,000, it's ongoing. And if you go to the next slide, Fran, you see the timeline, and in the middle you see an arrow on the bottom. So from March 22nd until September 25th, 2023, there's a consultation phase going on. So there was a draft of a restriction proposal, a very broad restriction proposal, by far wider than what Minnesota has done. It is restricting more or less all PFAS applications around any industry. Whether it is industrial application, consumer goods, it doesn't matter. More or less everything is restricted with different transition periods. And at the moment, we have a 6 months consultation phase. There are two committees working on it in ECHA. ECHA is the European Chemical Agency. One is the Risk Assessment Committee, and the other one is the Socioeconomic Assessment Committee, so the RAC and the SEAC. And until September 25th, 23:59, so before midnight of that day, anybody who is interested can put in a feedback to RAC or to SEAC. And we recommend, as a European Association, we recommend if you have scientific information that you do that. You can do it on a confidential base if it is information you don't want to share with everybody, just with the committees, but then you can just click on a little field saying it's confidential, and then it is seen that there is a feedback, but the people cannot read that. It is already now clear that it will be very complicated for ECHA to work on this document, because until now they have received more than 500 feedbacks they expect a couple of thousand feedbacks. So the timeline, which was originally done to be ready by the end of 2024, to finalize and to have the regulation entered into force, is not very realistic. So it's more realistic that it will be somewhere in Q3 2025, but even that is not clear. And looking at cookware, if we look at the current draft, within 18 months, if it stays in the current shape or form, PTFE coated cookware or bakeware or other type of PFAS coatings will be restricted fully in the European market, not only for sale, but also for manufacturing. So European manufacturers can no longer produce them in Europe and sell them outside of the European Union. From the unofficial feedback we get, there are a lot of rumors saying there will be a lot of changes, and other people say there will be no major changes because it's so important. So at the moment we have all extremes. It's very difficult to judge from all the feedback we have. The European Association for Cookware, FEC, what we did, we tried to look into the details. If you go to the next slide, Fran, please. So here you have the full life cycle, and that is what more or less all regulators and agencies are looking at and say, yes, we have the use phase, which is in the bottom right part, but we also have the manufacturing and the upper part and the end of life, the product disposal. And the interesting part is, if you just click one more, Fran, that we haven't found anybody objecting against a safe use phase. So whether it's ECHA, whether it is the 5 countries that have handed in the draft, which is Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. So none of them is really saying that the use phase is dangerous. So a little bit going beyond what Tom said, consumer goods, if something is safe, can be used. There should not be a difference between whether it is a food contact material or whether it is non-food contact, because if it's safe, it is safe. So there, more or less everybody agrees on. But the question was, what happens in manufacturing and what happens at the end of life? And you can click, please, once again. And that is what we did at FEC. We spent a lot of time on these two. And I want to share a little bit of inside information on manufacturing and then the end of life. So we can click again, Fran. So this is manufacturing. You see here the use of fluoropolymers in Europe. That was done by Plastics Europe. And one click more, you will see that the cookware is about 2,000 tons of fluoropolymers were used in 2020 for cookware. You can click probably 3 times. That makes my life a little bit easier, and yours, yes. So the risk of manufacturing of PTFE-coated cookware is not because of the PTFE, but because of fluoro-containing surfactants. In the past, it was PFOA, then it was Gen X, and so this is what more or less everybody agrees on. Even those NGOs or other or scientists that want to ban all applications of PFAS, they say in coating of cookware, the fluoro-containing surfactants are the problem. If you look at the current dispersions that are used in coatings, they have less than 1 ppm of these surfactants, which is 2,000 tons, less than 1 ppm. So that's less than 2 kilograms a year all over Europe. And suppliers of these dispersions have already agreed to reduce that content to 250 ppm, 250 ppb, sorry. So that would be 0.5 kilograms per year. And this is how much surfactant is present. And then that all the manufacturers have safety measures in place. And based on another study that was published recently, it was shown that at least 98% of the content is filtered out. So we are at 2 kilograms, 92 kilograms. We end up at 40 grams a year in Europe, coming from PTFE coating of cookware. and a full restriction is not proportionate to these quantities. We made a study of our members, and the estimated cost investments that have to be done in our industry is more than 200 million euros. So 200 million euros to get 40 grams of PFAS out of the environment is really not proportionate, at least to the point of view of FEC. Now, this is one thing we handed in to RAC. If you go to the next one, end of life, it's a very small slide. You see a lot of graphs, but you will get the presentation. But in short, in Europe, 31% of the materials, it's not just metals, it's everything, is recycled, 28% in incinerated, 24% in landfill, and 18% in composting. In the US, of course, it's different. Probably landfill will be by far higher. But the key for the circular economy is to get as much as possible into the recycling, especially if you talk about metals. And only if you cannot do something else, then you have to go into the incineration. If you go to the next one, and click 2 times more or 3, 1 more, yeah, good. So there is, since 2017, there is a best available technology reference in Europe that is used by the recycling of non-ferrous metals. And in there, they use calcium hydroxide filters to get rid of dioxins. So that is already there, it's in place. And then recently it was shown that if you have these in place and you heat up a PTFE coating to 400 degrees, 80% is transformed by the calcium hydroxide to calcium fluoride. So that's gone. 80% is already gone. And then last year, a Utah study showed that if you go to 1,100 degrees Celsius, 99 point, and then there are a lot of nines of PFAS are gone. So if you add all of that, there is technology available. Maybe it is not used today, or that the setting is not in place, but they can be. You just have to heat up a little bit more, and you just have to use the infrastructure that you already have. And therefore, it's possible to get rid of all PFAS at the end of life of cookware. This is the finding of about 6 months of work of the FEC teams. And also this we handed in to RAC. So if you go 1, and that means if 1 more, and then that means the key point is that in the life cycle, manufacturing, use, and disposal can be controlled, and therefore it makes no sense according to our findings. And we based most of our findings on publications, not from the industry. This was one of the targets that we did, trying to be as independently scientific as possible. Sometimes it's impossible because we have to rely on those companies that have done a study. But from everything we see, there is no base to restrict PFAS in Europe. Now, all of that information goes to RAC and SEAC, and then it will be a very long time that we don't know what's happening. We expect to hear more from time to time, some news. The best case would be that all fluoropolymer applications would be exempted, as the UK has proposed to do for the UK REACH proposal on PFAS. But that is the best case, but we definitely don't know what will happen. So that's about it for an update from Europe.
Thank you, Tobias. So I'm going to leave you all with some final thoughts before we go back to answering some questions. We have some time. The final thoughts, I wanted to let you know, for those of you here in the US, the efforts that the CBA has undertaken. At the top, you see a CBA PFAS legislation tracker. That is an old one. It's about 5 pages now. We watch enacted, proposed, died, whatever the state of the we watch legislation, and on this tracker, if it mentions PFAS, we check it out and then let you know where it lies. So it just is another tool to stay on top of what's going on. We have tools to help navigate different legislation. We did one specifically for AB 1200 and HB 1345. We have industry updates, which give you an overview on what you need to know. We are now up to about 25 of these updates available to our members. And there's a lot of other tools also available to the public on our Good Science homepage, right on cookwareandbakeware.org. If you go there, there's our PFAS education document #1, as well as several videos that we did with Tobias on covering what is PFAS in a nice short video series to get educated on PFAS. And just final thoughts is, I love what Tom just said. I'm gonna steal that, error on the side of compliance. Get educated. If you have been so far to date not engaged in this legislation, not on top of it, whatever your housewares category is, it's time to get caught up, and we are all here to help. I thank you all for who attended, and I thank to my partners and to Peter in the IHA. And Peter, I pass it back to you to handle the questions, which continue to grow.
Well, thanks again to our panelists, Fran Grossbeck, Thomas Lee, and Tobias Gerfen. Just a reminder, I know a lot of people are asking, a recording of today's roundtable will be available soon on homepagenews.com and the IHA website, which is housewares.org. We'll also look to make sure that today's attendees are aware when that recording is available and get them a link. It may take a couple days. We want to make sure we have everything in it that needs to be there. And that is, that will be yours to use and share as needed. And it will include the slides that are on today's presentation. Let's take a look at a few more questions. We got a few minutes to go. And I know you're all looking at the questions, and I'll pick a couple that I saw that I think we need to discuss. And there's some questions about unintentional addition of PFAS chemicals, and if a product is contaminated after, do you have to disclose that? Can you kind of give us a sense, maybe Tom can address that, on where the line is drawn between intentional and unintentional, and what the exposure to enforcement is depending on that?
Sure, absolutely. So again, as we talked about, all three of these laws, California, Colorado, and Minnesota, focus on intentionally added PFAS. So that is really the key determining factor. It is frankly not surprising that there will be some contamination of PFAS in products. That's why, and this isn't the focus of our discussion today, but when you think about marketing claims and the potential litigation risk there, PFAS free is a very troubling claim to make because it is very hard to support. You can have contamination from processed water that you use in manufacturing, from the packaging you wrap your products in. You could have someone who's working on your assembly line or your packaging line who uses a certain type of shampoo, touches their hair, touches your product, and introduces PFAS into it. So PFAS free is very difficult to support. And so it's not unusual for there to be unintentionally added PFAS in consumer products, which is why these laws specifically are built around this concept of intentionality. It's recognizing that there's a limit to how much manufacturers can control, but to the extent that they can control it, these state legislators expect you to do that. So unintentionally added PFAS is not within scope for these types of laws. Intentionally added PFAS is. Just a quick caveat to that, we talked earlier about how some other laws have a ppm standard. And so, for example, there's a California law on textiles, and the prohibition there is on regulated PFAS, and that's either intentionally added PFAS or PFAS that's present at 100 parts per million. And that is intended to capture that unintentionally added category of PFAS, but we're not seeing that in these laws at this point.
When it comes to testing, I think if I read it right, it's really going to be up to the supplier to provide the accredited testing information if they need to. Is there an auditing process? Are these enforcement groups going to have a way of auditing on their own? How often do you have to provide this information? Is there a little direction on that right now?
I don't want to monopolize the answers here, but maybe I'll take a first stab and let my co-panelists opine. So for these laws, the requirement is that you provide the disclosure, not that you test. So there's a number of ways of getting the information that you need in order to make those disclosures. Testing is certainly one of them. But what we're seeing some companies do is address this through the use of certifications. So you, manufacturer, brand owner, send a certification request to your upstream product or material supplier saying, certify to me that there is no intentionally added PFAS in what you provide, in any of the products that you provide to me. And then once you've sort of gone through the compliance exercise, gotten all those certifications, that can be the justification for your disclosures or your belief that you're compliant with the statute. There was a question about whether third-party labs in China can be used for testing. The third-party labs in China are set up for PFAS testing. It's not quite the same as the testing that's done in the US, but I won't get into it today because it is a long conversation, but PFAS testing is a very complicated subject. There is no one PFAS test. You can test for a small number of individual PFAS compounds, but not the other 11,000+. You can test for a broad set of organic chemistry that includes things that aren't PFAS, and there's pros and cons to each, but testing is not a simple sort of yes, no, check a box. It's a conversation. So long way of saying that yes, testing can be done. The state laws don't have a regular auditing schedule. Minnesota allows the agency to require you to test, but it really is more up to you to decide whether you want to satisfy your obligations through certifications and or some form of testing.
The one question was about testing, the need to test raw material versus finished product. I presume if you've done your work to get certifications, you've gone backstream to your suppliers and you've gotten the information you need from them as well too, correct?
Right. That's the whole point of Tom's comment about doing the full upstream and making sure you get certification from every component, we'll put it that way, of the product.
And maybe I can add something to the non-intended added PFAS. If you do a ceramic coating and you do it with a spray pyrolysis process, very often the guns to do the spray pyrolysis are coated with fluoropolymers. So it goes through fluoropolymers onto the coating. Yes, it should stay in the gun, but there might still be a little bit of added, and this is non-intended. So I agree fully with Tom. Stay away from free of.
And Peter, actually further on the topic of free of, just to make everyone aware, and a shout out to Noia Technica who helped us stay on top of this. For some people may be aware of the FTC Green Guides. FTC Green Guides back in June opened a comment period regarding recycling claims. During this open comment period, claims way beyond recycling were submitted for question and comment, including free of and non-toxic claims. So the FTC will now be, there is a current statement in the Green Guides about non-toxic and free of claims, but they will now be further expanded on and defined based on this. There isn't a timeline, but they were identified, and FTC it's on their agenda now. So this is now not just state by state legislation. This is not just what the EPA doing. This is now marketing claims with the FTC. So, and we've said from day one, similar to what Tom and Tobias are saying, the cross-contamination possibilities are endless. It could be the plastic bag the product ships in. It could be, actually, we had a lab who's not a member, but they are very advanced in this testing, find out that the ceiling tiles were contributing flakes and cross-contaminating the testing. That's how broad PFAS can be found. So those claims go beyond just the legislation. It's going to head to the FTC now.
Yeah, there's a question here that's interesting. Maybe we should be asking our attendees this question, but maybe you can shed some light on it. Are we aware of any major retailers that are starting to either require PFAS testing and labeling, or at least starting to ask that question loudly?
We are aware of retailers, yes, in different forms, asking for certification, asking for documentation, asking for different things to be signed. Yes, we are aware of many retailers taking action.
Okay.
And then if I add in Europe, the countries that are pushing, or retailers from countries that are pushing for the PFAS restrictions, so the Netherlands and Scandinavia, there are a couple of retailers that are already going in direction and saying it has to be an alternative to PFAS coatings.
Well,
And
we
maybe-
have many more questions on this. We're not going to be able to get to them as we have to wrap up in a couple seconds. Fran, if needed, can people just direct some questions to your attention? Maybe if there's an opportunity for you. Can you remind people how to reach you again, please?
If you use info@cookware.org, info, just info@cookware.org, you can get into our Ask Experts box, and then I will distribute it if needed to Tom. And when you get the presentation, Tom, I believe you put your contact information in there, and then you can always contact Tobias through the FEC site if you have questions on Europe.
Well, this is a complex and fluid issue. It is going to continue to be something that needs to be monitored. And the IHA and CBA plan to continue this educational series in the coming months. So stay tuned for more on that. I appreciate Fran, Tom, and Tobias joining us today. Lots of stuff to digest, lots of more to get to, and we'll do our best to get to it as we go through this process. On behalf of all of our panelists today, thanks for attending today's discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.